So friends, last week, Britta Dukes from Beth's Church started us off in a series on the theme of discipleship. I'm calling this series Discipleship in Difficult Times. And her invitation was around Jesus' words to take up our cross daily and to follow him. And she reminded us that taking up the cross is not a simple thing. It's not just a bear your burden. It's about being willing to literally sacrifice your life, to lay your life down for the things that God cares most about. And I want to continue today to preach in that vein. And I'm going to take the next few sermons to unpack the stories or a piece of the life experience of a couple of disciples who were disciples in difficult times. Martin Luther King Jr. and the letter that he wrote from a jail in Birmingham, Alabama in the midst of the civil rights movement. He was imprisoned for having led a demonstration in Birmingham, and from his jail cell wrote the letter to clergy in Birmingham called the Letter from the Birmingham Jail. And then after a couple of Sundays looking at that, I want to look at the life and the witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Reformed Christian pastor in Germany during the rise of the Nazi Party and during the horrors of the Second World War. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, like Martin Luther King Jr., both were killed for the witness that they bore. And so today I'm going to begin talking to you about that, and I want to talk a little bit about why I'm deciding to do this today. This letter from the jail in Birmingham, Alabama, written by Martin Luther King Jr., is a letter that lays out in very clear language the various factions that were fighting for justice in different ways within our nation during that period of time. And he articulates why he has chosen what he believes is a middle way, a way that finds its way between the passiveness of some members of the black community so beaten down over the years and the violent, aggressive posture of the Black Islam movement led by Malcolm X and others. And the way that Martin Luther King was trying to find, which was a middle way that did not stop fighting, that was not willing to acquiesce to the injustices, but which also sought to do so in a way that was not violent, that followed in the example of Jesus and in the example of Mahatma Gandhi, whose battle for independence in India had just recently concluded. It also is a letter that reminds us of the agitational role of the church in times of injustice, that the church has always been, and the people of God have always had, those men and women who have stood up as agitators of the status quo to make things uncomfortable for us so that we actually change and don't acquiesce to things that should not stay the same. It shakes us out of our complacency, and it shook the leaders of the Christian churches, the white Christian churches and Jewish synagogues of Birmingham, Alabama. And I think it speaks to us to shake us up today. So what precipitated the writing of this letter by Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, in April of 1963, after many, many months of attempting to negotiate with the leaders in Birmingham changes, and after receiving from them promises that they would do something as simple as remove from the storefronts the signs that were so denigrating to the black community, saying that they could not enter and sit at the lunch counter, or that they wouldn't serve blacks or dogs, to remove those signs from places of business. And they got promises from the leaders that those signs would be removed. And then they were not removed. And after a few weeks, they went back in the windows, even when they had been removed by some of the shop owners. And so there was a level of increased frustration on the part of the black leadership in Birmingham, Alabama. And so they invited the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to come in. And Martin Luther King Jr. was the president of that organization at the time. So he was invited in by one of the chapters, the Birmingham chapter of their organization. And they decided during Holy Week to engage in a march to try and make visible the invisible injustice that was being perpetrated against the black community. Well, there was a judge who declared an order that there could be no protests, no speaking out, no demonstrations of any kind, which was an absolute violation of their First Amendment rights as people to assemble and to speak freely their public opinions. And so the leadership decided that they would do a nonviolent direct action to confront this unjust law that the judge in Alabama had put in place to keep them silent and to keep them from bringing to light the injustices in that community. Well, all of the leadership was incarcerated, and they were incarcerated in very stark conditions, and they were not given anything. They didn't have any paper to write with, pens, anything. They couldn't communicate. And Martin Luther King Jr. had somebody sneak into him a copy while he was in jail of a letter that was written by white clergy and rabbis in Alabama telling him to settle down, telling him to just settle down and be more patient, that they needed to negotiate rather than demonstrate. And the letter that he wrote was a scathing but loving criticism of his white brothers in the clergy of Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama. Now, this letter is a reminder to me in so many ways of how we forget how our own tradition was so provocative and so challenging and so threatening. Just remember, for example, almost every letter that we have from the Apostle Paul was written where?
From jail.
From jail. Why? Because he was a threat to the people in control, whether they were the religious authorities or the secular Roman authorities. He was perceived to be an agitator, an outside agitator, a threat to the peace of their community. And what did they do with him? They put him in frickin' jail. They put him in jail. And that is where we got the letters that make up the vast majority of the New Testament. They are letters from jail, just like Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter. Lest we forget, John the Baptist was imprisoned and beheaded for proclaiming a gospel that was inclusive of all, that demanded justice. Jesus was imprisoned and tortured and crucified because he preached a gospel of freedom, justice, mercy, inclusion for all. Lest we forget, every single disciple of Jesus was imprisoned and eventually executed because they were all perceived as agitators who were not respecting the law and who were disobeying authorities. That is our tradition. That is how we came into being. That is what the church did for the first 3 centuries of its existence. And we forget that. And the people who wrote, the clergy who wrote that letter to Martin Luther King Jr. to tell him to settle down and shut up, were not respecting the deep roots of our tradition. The roots that call those who follow Jesus to take up their cross, to be willing to die for what they believe, to be willing to agitate for peace, for justice, for the inclusion of those who have been left out. That is our tradition. Now, I want to read a scripture today for this sermon that comes from Luke's Gospel. It comes at the end of the 14th chapter of Luke. Voy a leer la escritura que habla del costo del discipulado, el costo que fue pagado por todos los apóstoles, por Jesús, por Juan el Bautista, por Pablo, que escribió todas sus cartas desde la cárcel. Listen to this scripture in which Jesus talks to the crowds and invites them to be a disciple, but to consider how costly that choice will be. Large crowds were traveling with him. Sounds a little like a demonstration, doesn't it? And he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate their father and their mother and their wife and their children, their brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. For whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Which of you intending to build a tower does not first sit down and estimate the cost to make sure you have enough to complete it? Otherwise, when you have laid the foundation and are not able to finish it, all who see will begin to ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build, but wasn't able to finish.' What king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether with 10,000 troops he should oppose one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot beat that other king in battle, then while he is still far away, he will send a delegation and ask for terms of peace. Therefore, none of you can be my disciple if you do not give up all of your possessions." En español. Mucha gente seguía a Jesús, y él se volvió y dijo, "Si alguno viene a mí y no me ama más que a su padre, a su madre, a su esposa, a sus hijos, a sus hermanos y a sus hermanas, y aún más que a sí mismo, no puede ser mi discípulo. El que no toma su propia cruz y me sigue, no puede ser mi discípulo. Si alguno de ustedes quiere construir una torre, ¿acaso no se sienta primero a calcular los gastos para ver si tiene con qué terminarla? De otra manera, si pone los cimientos y después no puede terminarla, todos los que lo ven comenzarán a burlarse de él, diciendo, 'Este hombre empezó a construir, pero no pudo terminar.' O si algún rey tiene que ir a guerra contra otro rey, ¿acaso no se sienta primero a calcular si con 10,000 soldados puede hacer frente a quien va a atacarlo con 20,000? Y si no puede hacerle frente, cuando el otro está todavía lejos, le mandará mensajeros a pedir la paz. Así, cualquier de ustedes que no deje todo lo que tiene, no puede ser mi discípulo." Palabra de Dios. Te alabamos, Señor. So, I just wonder, how many of us, if in our new member class, when we are getting ready to join a church, had the pastor read that passage to us and say, "You want to join the church? Here's the rules.
This is what it means.
This is what it's going to take from you." I wonder, honestly, how many of us would turn around and walk the other way. And yet this is how Jesus invites the crowds to follow him. And follow they did, many. And some, in fact, thousands eventually, would give their lives because of him. We forget how agitational Jesus was. We forget how disruptive Jesus was. He was asking people who had lost almost everything in many cases, women who were working the streets as prostitutes, the poor who did not have hardly the capacity to eke out a life and existence, fishermen who struggled daily and paid incredible taxes. Jesus invited those with little to lose to be willing to let go of it all. He invited them to let go of the things they held dearest in order to embrace an even bigger family, an even bigger community out of a love for all and not just for the ones we know best. You know, I'm reminded of how jihadists recruit volunteers to be suicide bombers. They look for the ones who are most despondent, who are angry and frustrated. It's the same way white supremacists in our country look for recruits among the ranks of those disaffected and poor whites in our own country. And there they begin to plant the seeds of hatred and of violence to attack and to get back. Jesus sought out the same people, but he did not invite them to violence. He did not invite them to incite violence and hatred against others. Jesus invited them to be willing to die, but not willing to kill. To be willing to lay down their life for a love that was greater than any love they had known before. The love of mother or father or wife or children. The love of God for every human life. Martin Luther King Jr. was making that same kind of invitation to the clergy of the white churches and synagogues of Alabama. He was challenging them in Birmingham to lay down their positions of power, their positions of privilege, their positions of influence in the interest of a greater love. The love of all humanity. The love of the freedom and the justice that the gospel of Jesus Christ calls us to. That is what he was doing. He was taking a stand confessionally in the face of his brothers and sisters who saw what he was doing as something that was against God or against the gospel. And he, as a good confessing Christian must do at times, said, "Here I stand. I must be in this place." They had added him. They had added him for being an outside agitator, for not negotiating, for provoking, not negotiating. They had added him because he was in the streets rather than in the courts trying to do things decently and in order. They were adding him because he was breaking a law that a judge had set down.
An unconstitutional law.
That was his point. that was King's point.
Yeah.
They were adding him because they told him he was pushing at the wrong time, that if he just waited a little bit longer, the change would come.
Still waiting.
And here we are 60 years later, fighting some of the same damn battles again. And I hope this time it will be different. His first line of defense was to say to them, look, injustice anywhere is injustice threatened. Let's see, I said that completely wrong. Injustice present in any place threatens justice in every place. That he can't be someone who sits by idly in Atlanta, Georgia, when the injustices in Birmingham were glaring, when the brutality of the police was glaring. He said, the prophets in the 8th century left their villages to go and speak to the powerful kings of Israel about the injustices in the land. And so am I, leaving my town to come and speak about the injustice that is here. So I want this letter to be part of what we read together as a community of faith, because we are living in a time that is full of difficult, dangerous, problematic circumstances. I just listed a few of them. We have demonstrations and cries for justice that have included more people than any demonstrations in the history of this nation. Any, not even the civil rights demonstration, come close to the number of people who have been in the streets for so long in this country. We are watching the machinations and manipulation of court appointments in the highest court of our land right now. We are looking at the destruction of property through acts of hatred being done by some people who think violence is the way to get things to change. We are looking at repeated acts of official state violence by police and federal authorities both. We are looking at armed vigilante squads who are shooting and being shot and killed themselves. And we are looking at the deliberate violation of the truth in the interests of particular political agendas. We are in a dangerous time. We are in a dangerous place. And a lot is at risk in our communities and in our nation right now. And it is time for followers of Jesus Christ to stand up and be counted, just like Martin Luther King Jr. did. And his words point the way for us. His words point the way for me. He says, justice denied in one place is justice threatened in every place. So maybe it's not that here in this particular place where I sit, I feel the injustice the same. But if it is being denied to a community near me, then it behooves me to speak up on behalf of them. You know, protesters in the streets are seeking freedom from state-sanctioned violence against their communities right now. And it is a chance for us to stand with them and to say, that violence cannot continue to happen. It needs to be changed. It needs to be different. Because if it can continue against one community, then it can spread to another community. The second thing that Martin Luther King Jr. said in his letter to Birmingham, letter from the Birmingham jail, is that, what affects one person directly affects all people indirectly. Just look at the experience of George Floyd. One man, one act against one man. But look how it has indirectly rippled out to affect this entire nation in this moment. The racism and discrimination that has lain in quiet corners, dormant for many, many decades, is rising up to bite us again with such ferocity. And it's time for us to stand with those who have been affected by that violence quietly, hiddenly, for so many, many years. I want to read the words of Martin Luther King Jr. from this letter. It is a long letter. It's a 7-page letter, and I'm going to post the entire letter on my blog so you can read the entire thing if you like. But today I want to read 2 paragraphs as he writes to his brothers in the clergy in Birmingham. I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere else in this country. I cannot stay in my provincial world. That is exactly what Jesus said when he appealed to the crowds to follow, but to count the cost. Don't stay with your provincial life, with your provincial loves, the small loves that you have known of family and friends and brothers and sisters and children and wives and husbands. That little love must be given up to a greater love for all, the love that God has for every single human being, and especially for the ones who are least loved in a society or a community. You know, as a kid studying and as a college student studying the civil rights movement, I always imagined myself, yes, I would be on one of the buses with the Freedom Riders. I would be in the streets marching for civil rights and for an end to segregation. I imagined myself being one of the heroes. Right now, I'm feeling called. I'm feeling challenged by this time. I don't want 15 years from now, if I get 15 years, to look back and go, where were you, Mueller? Where were you standing? What were you saying? Who were you talking to? What message were you preaching? I don't want to be ashamed of where I stood. I want to be proud of standing with the Jesus who calls me to greater love, to the biggest love, to a love that embraces everyone. You see, this is a here I stand moment for me. And it might be for some of you as well. This is a moment where I have to say, I stand with the lives that have not mattered. Because I do believe all lives matter, but they cannot all matter until black and brown lives matter just as much as white lives do. Because when injustice is committed against one brown life or one black life, injustice is threatened in every life, including white lives. And when injustice is perpetrated continually against one community of color, it threatens the well-being of all communities of color. This is where I have to stand. And this is why I have to stand there. Because it is what Jesus calls us to be as disciples. Let us pray.